The sound of hoofbeats thundering through the dusty street outside the general store made Margaret Turner look up from the fabric she was examining. But by the time she registered something was wrong, the gunshots had already shattered the afternoon quiet of El Dorado, Kansas, and her younger sister Emma lay crumpled on the boardwalk, blood spreading across her yellow calico dress like a crimson bloom. Margaret's scream tore through the chaos as four riders wheeled their horses around, firing wildly into the air to scatter the townsfolk before racing toward the edge of town. She dropped to her knees beside Emma, pressing her hands desperately against the wound in her sister's chest. But even at 19 years old, Margaret understood what the gurgling breath and glazing eyes meant. Emma was 21, engaged to be married in just 3 weeks to the banker's son, and now she was dying on a sun-bleached boardwalk because she had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. "No, no, no," Margaret whispered, cradling Emma's head as people rushed toward them. "Stay with me, Emma. Please stay with me." Emma's lips moved, forming words that never came, and then the light left her eyes entirely. The spring afternoon of 1875 had turned into the worst day of Margaret's life in the span of heartbeats. Sheriff Daniels arrived too late, as lawmen so often did in Kansas cow towns where violence erupted as suddenly as prairie storms. He was a decent man, but old and tired, worn down by years of trying to maintain order in a place where cattle drives brought both prosperity and trouble. He knelt beside Margaret, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "I am so sorry, Miss Turner," he said quietly. "The McCarty gang, been hitting towns all along the Kishom Trail. I will send word to the marshal in Wichita." Margaret looked up at him with eyes that had gone cold and hard despite the tears streaming down her face. "When will someone go after them?" The sheriff's expression told her everything she needed to know. Resources were scarce, jurisdiction was complicated, and the McCarty gang had been operating with impunity for months. Emma would become just another name in a growing list of victims, another tragedy mourned and then forgotten as frontier life moved forward with its characteristic harsh indifference. The funeral 3 days later was well attended. Emma had been beloved in El Dorado, where the Turner sisters had lived since their parents died of cholera 2 years earlier. Margaret stood at the graveside in her black mourning dress, accepting condolences with mechanical politeness, while rage burned steadily in her chest. The banker's son wept openly. Friends and neighbors spoke of God's will and better places, but their words meant nothing to Margaret. Emma had been stolen from the world by men who cared nothing for the lives they destroyed, and no one seemed prepared to do anything about it. After everyone had left, Margaret remained at the fresh grave as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. She was still standing there when she heard a horse approach at an easy walk. She turned to see a man dismounting from a rangy bay gelding, removing his hat as he approached. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair and eyes that held a peculiar combination of gentleness and something harder that Margaret could not quite name. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice low and respectful. "My name is Xavier O'Brien. I wanted to pay my respects." Margaret studied him. She had seen him around town occasionally over the past year, usually buying supplies before disappearing back into the prairie. He worked as a ranch hand and occasional guide, someone had told her once, a man who kept mostly to himself. "Did you know my sister?" she asked. "No, madam, but I was in town when it happened. I saw the men who did this." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that might have seemed nervous except that everything else about him was perfectly still. "I recognized 2 of them, Ben McCarty and his brother Cole. The other 2 were probably Sam Dutton and a half-breed tracker they ride with called Snake Eye. Something in the way he spoke made Margaret's attention sharpen. "You know these men?" Xavier's jaw tightened. "I have crossed paths with them before. 3 years ago, they raided a homestead up in Nebraska where I was working. Killed the family I was helping to get established, burned everything. I tracked them for 2 weeks but lost their trail in the Black Hills." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked. He met her eyes directly. "Because Sheriff Daniels is not going after them, and I can see in your face that you are thinking about doing something foolish. The McCarty gang is not just 4 outlaws, Miss Turner. They have connections, hideouts, and they have been killing for a long time. If you are planning revenge, you will end up dead. Then what do you suggest?" Margaret's voice was sharp with barely contained fury. "That I just accept my sister's murder. That I let them ride away." "No," Xavier said quietly. "I suggest you let me go after them." Margaret stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because someone should. Because I have been hunting them for 3 years and this is the freshest trail I have had. Because your sister deserves justice." He paused. "And because no one else will do it. The law moves slowly when it moves at all, and the McCarty gang knows every bolt hole between here and the Wyoming territory. By the time any federal marshal organizes a posse, they will be long gone." Xavier's expression was grim. "I know how they think. I know where they might run. And I know I am probably the only person in 200 miles who cares enough to spend months tracking them if that is what it takes." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she would be the one to hunt her sister's killers, but she was not stupid. She could ride and shoot, as most frontier women could, but tracking dangerous outlaws across the wilderness was another matter entirely. Still, the thought of sitting in El Dorado while someone else pursued justice felt impossible. "I want to come with you," she said. "No, she was my sister." "Which is exactly why you should not come. Revenge is not the same as justice, Miss Turner, and what lies ahead will be ugly." Xavier settled his hat back on his head. "Let me do this. When it is done, I will come back and tell you how they died. How do I know you will really go? How do I know you will not just ride away and forget about it?" Xavier's eyes held hers for a long moment. "You do not. You will have to trust me." It was a strange conversation to be having over her sister's grave, and yet Margaret found herself believing him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was something she saw in his face, a sense that he understood loss and carried his own ghosts. "How long will it take?" she asked finally. "I do not know. Weeks, maybe months, but I will find them, Miss Turner, that much I can promise." He turned to leave, but Margaret called after him. "Why? Why does it matter so much to you?" Xavier paused, his back still to her. "Because the family they killed in Nebraska included a woman I was going to marry. Because I failed to stop them then, and I have been trying to make up for it ever since. Because some debts can only be paid in blood." Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the cemetery as the shadows grew long. The days that followed were strange and hollow. Margaret went through the motions of daily life, managing the small seamstress business she had built, but everything felt distant and unreal. At night she dreamed of Emma and woke with tears on her face. The rage never left, burning steady and cold in her chest. 3 weeks after Emma's death, Margaret was closing up her shop when Sheriff Daniels stopped by, his expression troubled. "Got word from Wichita," he said. "The McCarty gang hit a stage station near Newton, killed 2 people, stole the horses." Margaret's hands clenched on the bolt of fabric she was putting away. And nothing. Trail went cold in the Flint Hills. They are gone again." He sighed heavily. "I am sorry, Miss Turner, I truly am." After he left, Margaret stood in her empty shop and felt the weight of helplessness crushing down on her. Xavier O'Brien had been gone for 3 weeks with no word. For all she knew, He had lied, or he had tried and failed, or the McCarty gang had killed him too. Emma's murderers were still out there, still killing, and she could do nothing. She was locking the shop door when she saw the rider approaching through the evening gloom. Even before she could make out his features, she recognized the bay gelding and the way the man sat his saddle. Xavier O'Brien had returned. He dismounted slowly, moving like someone who had spent long days in the saddle. His clothes were dusty and worn, and there was a fresh bandage on his left forearm. "I found them," he said without preamble. "They have a hideout in the Gyp Hills about 50 miles northwest of here. Well hidden, defensible. That is why they have been so hard to catch." Margaret's heart began to pound. "You saw them from a distance. All four were there. I wanted to make sure of their location before I came back." He paused. "I am going after them tomorrow at first light. I wanted you to know. Take me with you. Miss Turner, my sister, is dead. Every day those men breathe is an insult to her memory. I will not sit here safely while you risk your life." Margaret's voice was fierce. "I can ride, I can shoot, and I will follow you whether you agree or not, so you might as well say yes." Xavier studied her in the gathering darkness. "It will be dangerous, not just the gang but the country itself. The Gyp Hills are rough terrain and spring storms can be deadly. I do not care. If something goes wrong, I may not be able to protect you. I am not asking you to protect me. I am asking you to let me be part of this." Margaret stepped closer. "She was my sister, Mr. O'Brien, my blood. I need to see this through." For a long moment, Xavier said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "We leave at dawn. Bring warm clothes, a good rifle if you have one, and enough food for a week. We will need to move fast and quiet. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then I will meet you at the livery stable when the sun rises." He started to turn away, then looked back. "Get some sleep, Miss Turner. It may be your last good rest for a while." Margaret barely slept that night. She packed carefully, trying to think of everything she might need, checking and rechecking her father's Winchester rifle. It felt surreal to be preparing for something like this, but the alternative was unbearable. Emma deserved justice, and Margaret would see it done. The sky was just beginning to lighten when she arrived at the livery stable. Xavier was already there, his bay saddled and a pack horse loaded with supplies. He looked her over with an appraising eye as she approached with her own horse, a sturdy paint mare named Bella. "You look ready," he said, and there might have been a hint of approval in his voice. They rode out of El Dorado as the sun broke over the horizon, heading northwest into the vast emptiness of the Kansas prairie. The spring morning was beautiful, the grass green from recent rains, wildflowers blooming in scattered patches. It seemed wrong somehow that the world could be so lovely when Emma was dead, but Margaret had learned that nature was indifferent to human grief. For the first few hours, they rode in silence. Xavier set a steady pace, not pushing hard but covering ground efficiently. He seemed completely at home in the saddle, moving with the kind of unconscious grace that came from years of living on horseback. Margaret found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking, trying to understand what manner of man would take on such a dangerous task for a stranger. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack. Margaret sat on a sun-warmed rock and watched Xavier check the pack-horse's load with meticulous care. "You said the gang killed your fiancée," she said finally. "What was her name?" Xavier glanced up, surprised by the question. For a moment she thought he would not answer, but then he said quietly, Rachel Winters. She was 18, the daughter of the homesteader I was working for. We were planning to marry that summer. I am sorry. So am I." He tightened a strap on the pack saddle. "Worst part is, I was not there when it happened. I had ridden to town for supplies. Came back to find the house burned, everyone dead. If I had been there, you might be dead too. Maybe. Or maybe I could have made a difference." Xavier's voice was flat, but Margaret heard the weight of old guilt beneath the words. "I have spent 3 years thinking about it. Does not change anything." Margaret understood that guilt intimately. She had been in the general store when Emma walked outside. If she had been faster, if she had called Emma back inside, if she had done 1,000 things differently, her sister might still be alive. "We cannot change the past," she said, "but maybe we can make the future mean something." Xavier looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding born of shared loss. "Maybe," he agreed. They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved into rougher country. The rolling prairie gave way to broken terrain, gullies and rock formations rising from the earth like ancient bones. Xavier navigated with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, choosing paths that were not always obvious but always seemed right. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered draw where a small stream provided water for the horses. Xavier built a small fire, keeping it low and shielded so the light would not be visible from a distance. They ate in comfortable silence, and Margaret found herself relaxing slightly despite the grim purpose of their journey. "Tell me about Emma," Xavier said suddenly as they sat watching the stars emerge. "What was she like?" The question caught Margaret off guard. No one had asked her that. Everyone in El Dorado had known Emma, and those who spoke of her since her death had focused on the tragedy, not the person. "She was kind," Margaret said slowly. "Really genuinely kind, not just polite. She saw the best in everyone. Used to drive me crazy sometimes because she was so trusting." She smiled despite the ache in her chest. She loved music. Could not carry a tune to save her life, but she loved it anyway. And she was funny. People do not mention that when they talk about her now, but she had this way of finding humor in everyday things. She sounds like she was special. She was. The world is lesser without her in it. Xavier poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting into the night sky. Rachel was like that too, always humming, always finding reasons to smile. After she died, I realized I had never told her how much that meant to me. How her happiness made everything better. "Do you think about her often?" Margaret asked. "Every day. But it has gotten easier over time. The sharp edges of grief wear down eventually, even if they never disappear entirely." He looked at her. "It will get easier for you too. Not quickly, and not completely, but eventually you will be able to remember Emma without it feeling like a knife in your chest." Margaret was not sure she believed him, but she appreciated the attempt at comfort. They sat in companionable silence until Xavier stood and began spreading out his bedroll. "We should sleep. Early start tomorrow, and the country gets rougher from here." Margaret nodded, arranging her own blankets on the other side of the fire. As she lay looking up at the vast sweep of stars, she realized that for the first time since Emma's death, the rage in her chest had banked to something more bearable. It was still there, still driving her forward, but it no longer felt like it was consuming her from the inside. Perhaps that was Xavier's presence, the sense that she was finally doing something rather than helplessly waiting. Or perhaps it was simply that grief, even at its worst, could not sustain itself at full intensity indefinitely. Either way, she fell asleep more peacefully than she had in weeks. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of riding, resting, and careful navigation through increasingly wild country. Xavier proved to be good company, quiet but not unfriendly, with occasional flashes of dry humor that surprised Margaret. He was knowledgeable about the land, pointing out edible plants and explaining how to read weather signs in the clouds. He was also, she came to realize, extremely competent. Everything he did, from making camp to tracking their route, was done with efficient skill. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Xavier called a halt on a low ridge and dismounted, studying the land ahead with a frown. Margaret joined him, looking out over a landscape of broken hills and twisted gypsum formations that gave the region its name. "We are close," Xavier said quietly. "Their camp is in a box canyon about 5 miles north of here. We will need to leave the horses and go in on foot once it gets dark." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What is the plan?" "Careful approach, assess the situation, and then we make our move. If we are lucky, we catch them sleeping and it is over quickly. If not," he shrugged, "we adapt. That is not much of a plan. Plans do not survive contact with reality. Better to stay flexible and think on our feet." Xavier met her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Miss Turner?" "Once we go down there, there is no taking it back." Margaret thought of Emma's blood spreading across the boardwalk, of her sister's eyes going empty and cold. "I am sure." They made a cold camp in a secluded hollow, not risking a fire this close to their target. As darkness fell, Xavier checked his weapons with meticulous care. A Colt revolver on his right hip, a knife on his belt, and a Winchester rifle similar to Margaret's. He moved with the calm focus of someone preparing for violence, and Margaret realized suddenly that she had no real idea who Xavier O'Brien was or what he had done in his life beyond the little he had told her. "Have you killed men before?" she asked. Xavier paused in loading his rifle. "Yes." "How many?" "I do not keep count." He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" Margaret considered. "I suppose it should, but no, it does not. Not if they were like the McCarty gang. They were not all outlaws. I fought in the war when I was younger. Killed men who were just doing what they thought was right, same as me." Xavier's expression was unreadable. "Violence is violence, Miss Turner. We can dress it up as justice or duty or whatever helps us sleep, but in the end, we are still taking lives. You should be sure you can live with that before we go down there." It was a fair warning, and Margaret appreciated his honesty. Could she kill someone? She wanted to believe the answer was yes, that she could pull the trigger and watch Ben McCarty fall for what he had done to Emma. But wanting something and being able to do it were different things. "I will do what needs to be done," she said finally. Xavier nodded, accepting her words at face value. "Stay behind me, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, find cover and be smart about your targets. These men are experienced killers. They will not hesitate." They left their horses hobbled in the hollow and began making their way through the darkness on foot. Xavier moved like a shadow, somehow finding paths through the rough terrain that made almost no sound. Margaret did her best to follow his example, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard for miles. The night was moonless, which worked in their favor. Stars provided just enough light to navigate by, but anyone looking their direction would see little more than vague shapes. It took over an hour to cover the 5 miles to the canyon entrance, moving slowly and carefully. Xavier held up a hand, and Margaret froze. Ahead, she could see a faint glow, the dying embers of a campfire deep in the canyon. Xavier leaned close, his breath warm on her ear as he whispered, "Stay here. I am going to scout the camp. If I am not back in 30 minutes, something has gone wrong. Head back to the horses and ride for El Dorado." Before Margaret could argue, he melted into the darkness and was gone. She crouched behind a boulder, clutching her rifle and straining her eyes into the blackness. Every sound seemed magnified, the whisper of wind through the rocks, the distant cry of a night bird, her own ragged breathing. The minutes crawled past. Margaret counted her heartbeats, trying to measure time. 20 minutes. 25. She was just starting to worry when Xavier materialized beside her so suddenly she nearly cried out. 4 men, all asleep around the fire," he whispered. "Horses are picketed at the far end of the canyon." No guards posted. They think they are safe here. What do we do? Xavier was silent for a moment, and Margaret knew he was weighing options. Smartest move would be to shoot them while they sleep. Quick, clean, minimal risk. But Margaret heard the hesitation in his voice. But that feels like murder, even if they deserve it. And I need to know for certain these are the men who killed Emma, not just some other outlaws using the same hideout. He looked at her. I am going to wake them. Give them a chance to surrender. If they go for their guns, we shoot. Does that sit right with you? It should not have mattered, Margaret thought. These men had not given Emma a chance. They had simply shot her down in the street and rode away. They deserved no mercy, no honorable confrontation, and yet she found herself nodding. Yes. I need to look them in the eyes. I need them to know why they are dying. Xavier's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed briefly. Stay behind cover and watch the one on the left, the smaller man. I will handle the other three. If he moves, shoot him. Can you do that? Yes. They moved forward together, keeping to the shadows at the canyon walls. The camp was crude, just bedrolls around a fire pit with saddles serving as pillows. 4 shapes lay in the dying firelight, snoring and oblivious. Xavier positioned himself where he could cover 3 of the men, and Margaret aimed her rifle at the 4th, a wiry figure wrapped in a dark blanket. Xavier's voice cut through the night like a knife. On your feet, all of you. Hands where I can see them. The camp exploded into motion. 3 of the men lurched awake, scrambling for weapons. The 4th, the one Margaret was covering, rolled sideways with surprising speed. Xavier's rifle barked twice, and 2 of the outlaws went down before they could clear their holsters. The 3rd got his gun up, but Xavier was faster. His 3rd shot taking the man in the chest. Margaret's target had gained his feet and was bringing up a pistol when she squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder, and the man staggered but did not fall. She worked the lever and fired again, and this time he dropped, his pistol falling from nerveless fingers. Then it was over. 4 bodies lay motionless around the camp. The canyon walls echoed with the fading gunshots, and then silence crashed down like a physical weight. Margaret's hands were shaking. She had killed a man. She had pointed her rifle at another human being and ended his life. It felt nothing like she had imagined. There was no sense of triumph or justice, just a strange emptiness and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Xavier was moving among the bodies, checking each one carefully. Ben McCarty, he said, nudging one with his boot. Cole McCarty, Sam Dutton, and Snake Eye. He looked up at Margaret. This is them. This is the gang that killed your sister. Margaret moved forward on unsteady legs, staring down at the dead men. They looked disappointingly ordinary in death. She had expected monsters, but they were just men, dirty and unshaven, wearing worn clothes and cheap boots. Ben McCarty, the leader, was perhaps 40, his face weathered and hard even in death. His brother Cole was younger, probably 30. Dutton looked to be in his 50s, and Snake Eye was a lean man of mixed heritage with a puckered scar across his left cheek. Are you all right? Xavier asked quietly. I do not know, Margaret admitted. I thought I would feel different, satisfied or at peace or something. Instead, I just feel tired. That is normal. Killing someone, even someone who deserves it, takes a piece of your soul. Xavier began searching the camp methodically. For what it is worth, you did well. Kept your head, made your shots count. That is not easy the first time. Is it supposed to be easy? No, if it ever becomes easy, that is when you should worry about yourself. They spent the next hour going through the camp. Xavier collected evidence, items that might have been stolen from victims, to document the gang's crimes. Margaret found a silver locket among Ben McCarty's possessions that made her heart stop. She opened it with trembling fingers and saw a tiny photograph of her parents, one she knew Emma had been carrying. She had this with her that day, Margaret whispered. These are my mother and father. Xavier looked at the locket, his expression grim. Keep it. At least now you can be certain we got the right men. They gathered the outlaws' horses and what supplies were worth taking, then built up the fire and burned the camp. Xavier said the bodies would be found eventually by scavengers or other travelers, but there was no point in trying to transport them. What mattered was that the McCarty gang would kill no more innocents. They rode through the remainder of the night, both wanting distance between themselves and that dark canyon. When dawn broke across the prairie, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and rose, they finally stopped to rest. Margaret dismounted and stood looking back toward the Gyp Hills, now just a dark smudge on the horizon. It was done. Emma's killers were dead. She should feel relief, closure, something positive. Instead, she just felt hollow. It does not bring her back, she said quietly. Xavier stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. No, nothing will bring her back, but at least she has been answered for. At least those men will not hurt anyone else. Is that enough? I do not know, but it is all we have. They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, two people bound together by violence and loss, watching the light spread across a land that cared nothing for human grief or justice. The journey back to El Dorado took 6 days. They rode at an easier pace, no longer driven by urgent purpose. The spring weather held fair, and gradually the oppressive weight of what they had done began to lift. They talked more as they traveled, sharing stories of their lives, finding unexpected commonalities despite their different backgrounds. Xavier, Margaret learned, was from Missouri originally, the son of Irish immigrants who had died when he was young. He had drifted west after the war, working as a cowhand, a scout, a dozen other jobs that kept him moving. He was 26, 3 years older than her sister had been, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned hard lessons and survived them. Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to him. It was not just his competence or his willingness to help her, though both were admirable. It was the way he listened when she talked about Emma, the small acts of consideration like making sure she had the softer ground for her bedroll or the better cut of meat at dinner. He was gentle in ways that seemed at odds with his capacity for violence, and she began to understand that perhaps those two things were not as contradictory as they appeared. On their 4th night out from the Gyp Hills, a spring storm rolled across the prairie with little warning. They had barely enough time to get the horses picketed and their gear under shelter before the rain arrived in sheets. Xavier rigged a canvas tarp between 2 scrub trees, creating a cramped but dry space, and they huddled together as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the ground. "Reminds me of storms back in Missouri," Xavier said, raising his voice to be heard over the downpour. "My mother used to say thunder was God's horses running across the sky." Margaret smiled. "My father always said it was angels bowling. That is a much more peaceful image." They sat in comfortable silence, shoulders pressed together in the small space. Margaret was acutely aware of Xavier's warmth, the solid presence of him beside her. Somewhere in the past week, her feelings toward him had shifted from gratitude to something more complicated. "What will you do now?" she asked. "After we get back to El Dorado." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know. I have been hunting the McCarty gang for 3 years. It has been my purpose, the thing that kept me moving. Now that it is done, I suppose I will need to find something else." "You could stay in El Dorado. There is always work for a good man." "Is that what I am? A good man?" Margaret turned to look at him, her face just inches from his in the dim light. "Yes, you are a good man who has done hard things because they needed doing. That is more than most people can claim." Xavier's hand came up, his fingers brushing her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You are remarkable, Margaret Turner. You know that. I am just a woman trying to make sense of a senseless world. No, you are more than that. You are brave and strong, and you do not quit even when things seem impossible." His thumb traced along her jaw. "I have met a lot of people in my travels, but none quite like you." Margaret's breath caught. She knew she should pull away, should maintain proper distance. They were alone in the wilderness with no chaperone, and her sister had been dead less than 2 months. By all the rules of society and mourning, this was deeply inappropriate. But society's rules seemed very distant with rain hammering on the canvas above them, and Xavier's eyes dark and intense on hers. Emma was gone, and no amount of propriety would bring her back. All Margaret had was this moment, this connection with someone who understood her grief and had stood beside her through darkness. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him. Xavier went very still for a heartbeat, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close as he returned the kiss with a desperation that matched her own. It was not gentle or tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had looked at death and chosen to affirm life, who had found each other in the midst of tragedy and refused to let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that. I started it." "Still, you are mourning and I am," he stopped, seeming to search for words. "I do not want to take advantage of your vulnerability." Margaret pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Do you want me, honestly?" "Yes. God help me, yes. From the first moment I saw you standing at your sister's grave, fierce and grieving and refusing to break, I wanted you. Then stop being noble and kiss me again." Xavier laughed, a surprised sound that held both relief and joy. "Yes, madam." This time when they came together, it was slower, more exploratory. They kissed until the storm passed and the stars emerged, and then they simply held each other, finding comfort in shared warmth and the knowledge that they were no longer alone. "I do not want this to be just about grief or proximity," Xavier said quietly as Margaret rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You deserve better than that. What do you want it to be about? I want to court you properly, take you to church socials and dinners. Let people see us together in daylight, not just hidden in the darkness. I want to know your favorite color and what makes you laugh and what you dream about." His arms tightened around her. "I want to build something real with you if you will have me." Margaret smiled against his shirt. "My favorite color is green, spring green like new grass. I laugh at terrible puns that should not be funny. And I dream about having a place that is truly mine where I can build a life on my own terms." "Green like new grass," Xavier repeated. "I can work with that." They rode into El Dorado late on a warm afternoon, both dusty and trail-worn but somehow lighter than when they had left. Word of their return spread quickly, and Sheriff Daniels met them at the livery stable, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Miss Turner, Mr. O'Brien. I had about given up hope on seeing you again. Is it done?" "It is done," Xavier confirmed. "The McCarty gang will not be troubling anyone else." The sheriff looked between them, taking in their closeness and the way Xavier's hand had settled naturally on Margaret's back. "I see. Well, I suppose congratulations are in order, for justice served at least." He cleared his throat. "There will be questions, of course, paperwork, but given the circumstances, I do not expect any trouble from the law." He was right. Over the next few days, Xavier gave a full accounting of what had happened to both the local sheriff and a federal marshal who happened to be passing through. The marshal seemed more relieved than anything that the McCarty gang was no longer his problem, and he took Xavier's report with minimal fuss. The consensus seemed to be that the world was better off without Ben McCarty and his men, and no one was inclined to make trouble for those who had done what the law could not. Margaret returned to her seamstress shop and her small house, trying to settle back into normal life. But everything felt different now. The town seemed smaller, the daily routines less important. She had seen too much, done too much, to simply return to the person she had been before Emma's death. Xavier stayed in El Dorado, taking a job at one of the larger ranches outside town. True to his word, he began courting Margaret properly. He came calling on Sunday afternoons, awkward and formal in his good clothes. He escorted her to church and community gatherings. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers picked from the prairie, a hair ribbon in spring green that he must have ridden to Wichita to find. The town gossips were scandalized at first that Margaret would be seen with a man so soon after her sister's death. But the story of what Xavier had done, how he had hunted down Emma's killers and brought them to justice, spread through El Dorado and beyond. Gradually, disapproval turned to romantic approval. Here was a real frontier love story, tragedy transformed by courage and devotion. For Margaret, falling in love with Xavier was as natural as breathing. She already knew his character, had seen him at his best and his worst. The courtship was simply allowing them to discover the softer sides of each other, the parts that had no place on a dangerous trail but mattered in daily life. She learned that he liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he had a gift for whistling complicated melodies, that he read poetry when he thought no one was watching. He learned that she was stubborn about the strangest things, that she hummed while she sewed, that she had a competitive streak when it came to cards that made her dangerous at the town socials. Summer deepened into autumn, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold. On a cool October evening, as they sat on the porch of Margaret's house watching the sunset, Xavier took her hand. "I know it has not been very long," he said, "and I know you might want more time, but I need you to know that I love you, Margaret. Not because of what we went through together, though that is part of it, but because of who you are, your strength and your kindness and your refusal to let the world beat you down." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I love you too, Xavier. I think I have loved you since that day at Emma's grave when you promised to bring her justice and then actually did it. I want to marry you. I want to build that life you dream about, the place that is truly yours. I do not have much to offer, just my name and my heart and whatever future I can make with these two hands. But if that is enough, it is more than enough," Margaret said, and kissed him to seal the promise. They married in December, a quiet ceremony in the El Dorado church with only a few close friends in attendance. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself, deep green like spring grass, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier wore a new suit that he was clearly uncomfortable in, but he smiled throughout the ceremony like he could not quite believe his good fortune. After the wedding, they moved into a small house on the ranch where Xavier worked. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. Margaret continued her seamstress work, and Xavier proved to be as good at ranching as he was at everything else he turned his hand to. They built a life together, day by day, finding joy in small things. Some nights, Margaret still dreamed of Emma. But increasingly, those dreams were not nightmares of blood and gunfire. Instead, she dreamed of Emma smiling, Emma laughing, Emma as she had been in life rather than in death. She took that as a sign that she was healing, that the sharp edges of grief were wearing down just as Xavier had promised they would. She visited Emma's grave every week, bringing fresh flowers and talking to her sister about her life. She told Emma about Xavier, about their home, about the future they were building. And she always ended by saying thank you, because in a strange way, she had Xavier because of Emma. Tragedy had brought them together, and they had chosen to transform that tragedy into something beautiful. Spring came again to Kansas, bringing green grass and wildflowers and the smell of rain on the wind. Margaret stood on the porch of her home, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, watching Xavier work with the horses in the corral. He looked up, caught her watching, and smiled that smile that was just for her. She smiled back, filled with a contentment she had never expected to feel again. Emma was gone, and that wound would never completely heal. But life continued, and love continued, and she had found both in the last place she would have thought to look. "Come here," Xavier called, and Margaret walked out to join him, slipping her hand into his as naturally as breathing. "Everything all right?" he asked, pulling her close. "Everything is perfect," she said, and meant it. They stood together in the spring sunshine, two people who had found each other through darkness and chosen to walk together into the light. It was not the life Margaret had imagined for herself a year ago. But it was a good life, an honest life, built on foundation of shared courage and deeper love than she had known was possible. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier said quietly, "I have been thinking about names." Margaret looked up at him. "For the baby?" "Yes, if it is a girl," I thought. He paused. "Would you want to name her Emma, after your sister?" Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had not dared to suggest it herself, had not known if it would be appropriate, or if it would be too painful. But hearing Xavier offer it, knowing he understood how important it was to keep Emma's memory alive, filled her with overwhelming love for this man who had become her partner in all things. "Yes," she whispered, "I would like that very much. And if it is a boy, I was thinking maybe we could use your father's name. Thomas. His name was Thomas. Thomas O'Brien. That has a good sound to it." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, imagining the future that lay before them. A child, maybe more children. Growing old together on this land they were learning to love, building traditions and memories to replace the ones that had been stolen. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking on the McCarty gang, coming to El Dorado?" "Not for a single moment. Hunting them down gave Rachel's death meaning. And it brought me to you." Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "If I could go back and change things, I would save Rachel and Emma both, but I cannot. All I can do is make sure their memories are honored by the life I live going forward." "We live," Margaret corrected. "The life we live." "We," Xavier agreed. They sat in peaceful silence as the stars began to emerge, the vast Kansas sky opening up above them like a benediction. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the rising moon. It was not the ending Margaret would have chosen for Emma's story, but it was a good beginning for her own. And in the end, perhaps that was what life was about, taking the broken pieces tragedy left behind and reassembling them into something new, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Winter came again, bringing snow that blanketed the prairie in pristine white. Margaret went into labor on a cold January night, with Xavier holding her hand and the local midwife coaching her through the pain. It was long and difficult, but when dawn broke and the baby's cry filled their small house, Margaret knew that every moment had been worth it. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling bundle in Margaret's arms. "Healthy lungs on this one." Margaret looked down at her son's red, furious face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Xavier knelt beside the bed, his expression awed as he gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "Thomas," Margaret said softly. "Thomas Xavier O'Brien." Thomas, Xavier repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Hello, son, welcome to the world." The baby quieted at the sound of his father's voice, his eyes opening to reveal the dark blue of all newborns. Margaret watched Xavier watching their son and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This man had given her justice, yes, but more than that, he had given her love and partnership and a future she had not dared to dream of. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier looked up, confused. "For what?" "For everything, for finding me, for helping me, for loving me. For this." She looked down at Thomas, who had wrapped his tiny fingers around one of Xavier's much larger ones. "For giving me reasons to keep going when I thought the grief would swallow me whole." "Margaret." Xavier's free hand cupped her face gently. "You were the one who kept going. You were the one who had the courage to face down your sister's killers. You were the one who chose to build a life instead of drowning in revenge. I just had the good fortune to be there when you did it. We both did it. Together." "Together," Xavier agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, of learning to be parents and adjusting to their new reality. Thomas proved to be a good baby, healthy and curious, with Xavier's dark hair and what Margaret's friends swore would be her gray eyes once the baby blue faded. Xavier was a devoted father, patient and gentle in ways that surprised no one who knew him well. He could calm Thomas's cries with a few words of whispered Irish song, could make the baby laugh with silly faces, could change diapers and warm bottles without complaint. Watching him with their son, Margaret fell in love with him all over again. Spring arrived again, 2 years after that terrible day when Emma had died. Margaret took Thomas to visit Emma's grave, the boy toddling unsteadily between his parents on legs that were still learning their strength. "This is your Aunt Emma," Margaret told him, touching the gravestone. "You never got to meet her, but she was wonderful, kind and funny and so full of life. I think she would have loved you very much." Thomas, not quite understanding but sensing the solemnity of the moment, placed a chubby hand on the stone. "Emma," he repeated carefully. Xavier picked him up, settling the boy on his hip. "That is right, son, Emma. We remember her, and we keep her memory alive by living good lives and being kind to others. Can you do that?" "Yes, Papa." Margaret placed fresh flowers on the grave, wildflowers picked from the prairie because Emma had always loved them. As they walked back toward town, Thomas chattering about everything he saw, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Emma was gone, but she was not forgotten. Her memory lived on in stories and in the way her death had brought 2 people together who might never have met otherwise. That evening, as they prepared for bed in their small house, Xavier said casually, "I have been thinking we might need a bigger place soon." Margaret looked up from brushing her hair. "Why is that?" "Because Thomas will need a brother or sister eventually. And I was thinking about maybe starting a horse breeding operation, which would require more land." He paused. "There is a homestead claim available about 20 miles west of here. Good water, good grass, room to grow. What would you think about making a real go of it? Building something that is truly ours?" Margaret set down her brush, considering. It would mean leaving El Dorado, leaving the town where she had spent most of her adult life. But it would also mean new beginnings, a fresh start in a place unmarked by tragedy. "What about your job at the ranch?" she asked. "I have saved enough that we could make it through the first year if we are careful, and I am good with horses. I think I could build a reputation, make it work." Xavier came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "But only if you want to. I will not make you leave Emma." Margaret thought about that. For a long time, she had clung to El Dorado because it was where Emma was buried, where her sister's memory was strongest. But increasingly, she had come to understand that Emma's memory lived in her heart, not in a place. She could honor her sister anywhere. "Tell me about this homestead," she said. Xavier's face lit up, and he began describing the property with the enthusiasm of someone who had clearly been thinking about this for a while. A small cabin that needed work, a good creek, rolling prairie as far as the eye could see. Room for horses and cattle, room for children to run and explore, room for a life bigger than what they had now. "We could call it the Turner O'Brien Ranch," Xavier said, "after both our families. A place that remembers where we came from while looking forward to where we are going." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her whole world. "Yes," she said simply. "Let us do it. Let us build something new." They moved in the summer, packing their modest possessions into a wagon and heading west with Thomas wedged between them on the seat. The cabin was indeed small and rough, but it had good bones, and Xavier immediately began making improvements. Margaret set up her sewing corner and began work on curtains and quilts that would turn the cabin into a home. The work was hard, harder than anything Margaret had done before. There were days when she wondered if they had made a mistake, when the isolation felt overwhelming and the challenges seemed insurmountable. But there were also moments of transcendent beauty. Thomas laughing as he chased butterflies through wildflowers, Xavier coming in from a successful day breaking a young horse and swinging her around the kitchen, sitting on their porch watching thunderstorms roll across the prairie. They found their rhythm gradually. Xavier proved to have a real gift with horses, and word of his skill spread through the region. Ranchers began bringing him animals to train, paying good money for his expertise. Margaret took in sewing work from neighboring homesteads and taught herself to make butter and cheese to sell in town. Slowly but surely, the Turner O'Brien Ranch became profitable. 3 years after they had arrived, Margaret gave birth to a daughter. The labor was easier this time, and when the midwife placed the baby in her arms, Margaret looked down at the tiny girl and felt Emma's presence so strongly it was almost physical. "Emma Margaret O'Brien," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome home, sweetheart." Xavier, holding Thomas's hand as their son stared wide-eyed at his new sister, had tears in his own eyes. "She looks like you." "She looks like Emma," Margaret corrected softly. "She has her nose and her chin, like she is saying hello, letting us know she is still with us." As baby Emma grew, the resemblance to her namesake became even more pronounced. She had the same quick smile, the same sunny disposition, the same gift for finding joy in simple things. It was bittersweet but also healing, a reminder that love persisted beyond death, that something of Emma lived on in this new life. Thomas proved to be a protective older brother, watching over Emma with fierce devotion. Xavier built a larger house as the ranch prospered, adding rooms for their growing family and a proper kitchen for Margaret. They planted trees for shade and a garden for vegetables, dug a better well, and built corrals and a barn for the horses. Years passed, marked by seasons and celebrations, by hard work and harder-won successes. More children came, 2 more boys and another girl, filling the house with noise and laughter. The ranch grew from a struggling homestead to a thriving operation, known throughout Kansas for the quality of its horses. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Margaret by taking her back to El Dorado. They visited Emma's grave together, bringing flowers and stories of their children, telling Emma's stone about the life they had built. "I hope she would be proud," Margaret said quietly. "She would be more than proud. She would be amazed at what you have accomplished, at the family you have raised, at the woman you have become." Xavier put his arm around her shoulders. "You have honored her memory better than any monument could." "We have honored her memory," Margaret corrected. I could not have done any of this without you. Partners, Xavier said. Partners, Margaret agreed. They stayed overnight in El Dorado, visiting old friends and seeing how the town had changed. It was smaller than Margaret remembered, and she realized with some surprise that she no longer felt like it was home. Home was their ranch, the house they had built together, the life they had created from grief and determination. As they rode back west the next day, Margaret looked at the man beside her, gray just beginning to show at his temples, laugh lines crinkling around his eyes. They had been through so much together, had built something real and lasting from the ashes of tragedy. "Do you remember that night in the storm?" she asked suddenly. "When we were hunting the McCarty gang," Xavier glanced at her, a smile playing at his lips. "When you kissed me and told me to stop being noble, that is the one. Did you know then that we would end up here, building a life together?" "I hoped. I did not dare to believe it, but I hoped." He reached over and took her hand. "Best decision I ever made going to your sister's grave that day. Second best was kissing you back in that storm." Margaret laughed. "What about marrying me, starting the ranch, our children?" "All of that was just following through on those first decisions. The course was set the moment I saw you standing there, fierce and grieving and absolutely refusing to break. I knew then that if I could just convince you to give me a chance, I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "Xavier O'Brien, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "I am full of surprises after 10 years. They rode on, hands linked, heading home to their children and their ranch and the future they had built together. The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly around them, golden in the afternoon sun, full of possibility and promise. More years passed, each one adding new chapters to their story. Thomas grew into a fine young man, as comfortable with horses as his father and with his mother's steady determination. He married a neighboring rancher's daughter and brought her home to the Turner O'Brien ranch, expanding the family and the operation. Young Emma, so like her namesake in spirit, became a teacher, establishing a small school that served the scattered homesteads in their region. The younger children found their own paths, building on the foundation their parents had established. Margaret and Xavier grew old together, their hands weathered by work, their faces lined by sun and laughter. They sat on the porch of the house they had built, watching grandchildren play in the yard, and counted themselves blessed. On warm summer evenings, Margaret would still tell the story of Emma, keeping her sister's memory alive for generations that had never known her. She talked about Emma's kindness and humor, about the terrible day she had died, about the cowboy who had tracked down her killers and in doing so had found love. "Your grandfather was a hero," she told her grandchildren. "But more than that, he was good. He saw someone who needed help and he gave it, expecting nothing in return. That is the legacy I want you to carry forward. Not violence or revenge, but simple human decency. Helping others because it is right, because we are all connected in ways we cannot always see." Xavier, listening from his chair, would add, "And your grandmother was the bravest person I ever met. She faced her grief head-on, refused to let it consume her, and chose to build something beautiful from the ashes. That takes more courage than any gunfight ever could." They had built a good life, a life that honored Emma's memory while celebrating the future. The Turner O'Brien Ranch became known throughout Kansas not just for its horses, but for the family that ran it, people who were fair in their dealings and generous to those in need. Margaret and Xavier had created a legacy that would outlast them, a testament to the transformative power of love and determination. In the autumn of their 40th year of marriage, as they sat watching the sun set over prairie that had become as familiar as breathing, Xavier took Margaret's hand just as he had done countless times before. "You have any regrets?" he asked quietly. Margaret thought about the question seriously. Her life had not been easy. She had known tragedy and loss, had killed men and lived with that knowledge, had worked until her hands were raw and her back ached. But she had also known deep and abiding love, had raised children and seen them thrive, had built something meaningful from nothing. "I regret Emma's death," she said finally. "I will always regret that, but I do not regret anything that came after. Every choice we made, every hardship we faced, it all led here. To this life, this family, this moment. So no, I have no regrets." "Neither do I," Xavier said. "You have given me 40 years of happiness, Margaret Turner O'Brien, made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. Given me a purpose beyond just surviving or seeking revenge. I would not change a single moment. Not even the hard times, the droughts and the harsh winters and the nights we did not know if we would make it, especially not those times. They proved we could survive anything as long as we were together." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You are the love of my life, Margaret. From that first moment at Emma's grave to right now, you have been my North Star." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you, Xavier O'Brien, for everything you are, everything you have been, and everything we have built together." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars emerged, the same stars that had watched over them through decades of joy and sorrow. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the distant sound of their grandchildren's laughter. Inside the house, their children and their children's spouses were preparing dinner, continuing the traditions Margaret and Xavier had established. This was what mattered, Margaret thought. Not the violence of the past or the uncertainty of the future, but this moment, this connection, this life they had created together. Emma's death had been a tragedy, but it had also been a beginning in ways no one could have predicted. From loss had come love, from grief had come growth, from tragedy had come triumph. The Turner O'Brien Ranch would continue long after they were gone, a living testament to two people who had refused to let tragedy define them. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the values they had instilled: courage, kindness, hard work, and above all, love that persisted through whatever hardships life threw at it. As the last light faded from the western sky, Xavier helped Margaret to her feet, and they walked slowly inside together, hands linked as they had been for 40 years. Behind them, the prairie stretched endlessly into the darkness, unchanging and eternal, witness to everything that had passed and everything yet to come. It was a good life, Margaret thought as Xavier held the door for her. A hard life, sometimes a painful life, but a good life nonetheless. Emma would have approved. More than that, Emma would have been proud of what her death had ultimately created. Not just justice, but love, family, and a legacy that would endure for generations. And really, what more could anyone ask for? They had taken the worst thing that could happen and transformed it into something beautiful. They had turned grief into grace, revenge into redemption, loss into love. That was their story, their truth, their gift to the world. Inside, surrounded by family and filled with love, Margaret Turner O'Brien looked at her husband and smiled, grateful beyond words for the journey they had shared and the life they had built together on the Kansas prairie, under vast skies that held all the promise and possibility that comes from choosing hope over despair, love over hate, and always moving forward together into whatever tomorrow might bring.